Thank you, Daniela. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you all. We're really excited to take some time to go through CarbonHub with you all and talk about kind of what's changed from what we had released in February. To begin, I just want to review our energy and sustainability ERP. So CarbonHub is one piece of that. That is where CarbonHub is for your financial grade greenhouse gas accounting, where we're really focused in on GHG emissions and categorizing them and reporting them in ways that make sense for sustainability. On the left, we have Energy Cap Utility Management. So as of yesterday, we renamed what have known as Energy Cap to be Energy Cap Utility Management. We did this intentionally to give it its own identity, separate from CarbonHub and Smart Analytics. And this is your portfolio level energy and sustainability reporting. This is where you're focused on your utility bills and costs and usage at a building and organization level. Energy Cap, as you will see today as we go through it, CarbonHub and utility management are really seamlessly integrated. So a lot of what you remembered using how you use CarbonHub with utility management, you're going to find that that's very familiar in the new version of CarbonHub. But the new version of CarbonHub just gives you that much more functionality and flexibility that we didn't have utility management. And then the third piece of our energy and sustainability ERP is Smart Analytics. This is formerly known as Wattix. We renamed that on Monday as well. And this is for your real-time energy and sustainability analytics. We're really wanting to focus on that real-time data as the energy is being used within your facilities to really dive deep into what's going on inside your facilities. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump in. So question number one, where did my emissions go? When we sent out CarbonHub, we sent out a notification about about a month ago to say, hey, this is coming. We've been talking about it for a while and it's going to happen on September 18th. We did make that change. So a lot of folks, when you've logged in, you probably saw, when you logged into Energy Cap Utility Management, you probably saw something like this that talked about some new things that we've added to utility management, but then we highlighted, hey, if you are a CarbonHub subscriber, we now have a first-class application all by itself called CarbonHub. Go over and read the release notes there about that. And if you went to your buildings and meters module and you went to the CarbonHub tab that you may have been used to going to, you would have noticed, hey, where's my emissions data? It's not here. Well, first of all, we didn't move it or we didn't get rid of it. It's still there. And what I want to highlight is that it's available from your calendarized greenhouse gas tab. So all of the emissions data you had on Friday is there on Monday. However, we have these banners now that point you to say, there's more detail, more information, more you can do with this in CarbonHub. There's no management functionality and utility management related to emissions data anymore. All of that is done in CarbonHub. And what I want to show you real quick is, how did we do this conversion? So on Monday, we took any meter that had GHG settings applied to it, and we created an emission source in CarbonHub for that. So that's what we're showing here, this diagram. So in this hierarchy, I had 2 meters under the City Hall node, City Hall building, that had GHG settings applied to it. And we made emission sources with the same name. We put them in CarbonHub, and we also made collections for each building and organization that meter was within. So the hierarchy is all there. Now that hierarchy was a one-time migration. It was just to help kind of transition the data that you had previously, but now it's really flexible for your sustainability reporting needs. You can move things around, regroup, reorganize, make new collections, in a way that makes sense for your sustainability reporting needs, separate from what your facility managers might want on the buildings and meters side. So we did that one-time migration for you, but now it's totally flexible. You can move things around, and the linkages between a meter and that emission source will maintain no matter where you move that emission source within your emissions emission sources hierarchy in CarbonHub. So a lot of you may be asking, or sorry, which wanted to show one more thing. So you'll notice that when you're on that calendarized greenhouse gas tab, and if we go to a specific meter, there is a card that shows the emissions total. And if we went to the linked emission source, we would see that same thing there. So all the data is still there. No data has been lost. We've just moved things. We've made some new things and we've linked everything up. But many of you may be asking, what are emission sources? What are records and what are collections? So let's talk about those. These are the main elements in CarbonHub: emission records, emission sources, collections, and record lists. And I'm going to walk through the UI of CarbonHub real quickly and just kind of highlight what those things are. So I'm back in utility management now, and I'm on this CarbonHub tab. If I drill down to one of these electric meters, again, this is what I had a screenshot of. This is that same view, and we have a link in the banner here to go to CarbonHub. We also have a link in the header, or a tag in the header, for any meter that has been linked to an emission source in CarbonHub. So it's a quick way to jump into CarbonHub. So once I do that, if I'm on a meter, I'll jump to its sister emission source within CarbonHub. And you can see right now I am on an emission source, and it looks a lot like a meter, and that was purposeful. We did that intentionally so that folks would be comfortable with the concepts and the paradigms that exist in CarbonHub. So an emission source is like a meter, except it's just a lot simpler. You don't need an account and a vendor and all of those things set up to add emissions records. So let's talk about emissions records. So if I have a records tab here on my emissions source, and if I pull this up, a lot of you who are utility management users may say, well, that looks awfully like a bill list. Well, yes, it does, and that was intentional. We wanted to make it look very similar to a bill list. So again, you're comfortable with the concepts and the functionality. There's not a huge learning curve in CarbonHub because we're doing things very similar to how we do them over in utility management. But instead of this being a list of bills, these are a list of emissions records, which if I open one of these up, it's essentially a date and time, a scope category, a GHG factor, and the quantity that was used to calculate the emissions. I'm going to pick a different record here that's a little bit more, well, that's a reverse bill, so we'll go here. Here we go. So you can see this record's on the City Hall ELE01 emission source. And I didn't call this out, but when we made those emission sources from those meters, we used the same names, so they're very familiar. This has been generated from a bill, and there's a link to that bill, and I'll show that off in a little while. There's also a link to what we call a supplier in CarbonHub, but also it's related to a vendor in utility management. There's a link off to that as well. We have the start and the end date, the scope category, the factor that was used to calculate these emissions. If the factor had a description on it, that's shown here in the pop-up. If I click on this factor, I can see a history of all the versions of that factor, so the gas amounts that are applicable depending on the date. And then I see the total emissions that were calculated from the usage, the electric usage here. We can also add notes to emissions records, and if I type in a note right here, I get to save it, and it shows up here on the list, and I can hover over that note in the list and see what it says. So it's a great way to add a little bit more detail and have a way to see that without needing to open each record up and see what's put there. If I go to edit this record, notice that a lot of it is not editable, and that's intentional because this record was generated from a utility bill. So all of the aspects that go into calculating those emissions, aside from the factor, are more to do with the bill and not to do with the record itself. So you can't change the quantity and you can't change the cost here. If you want to do that, we give you a link to go to the bill and edit those properties there. But you can change the scope category, you can change the factor. So if something was configured incorrectly and the wrong factor was used, you can change it here instead. So that's what an emission record is. And we talked a little bit about record lists. So a record list is just a list of those records. And here I'm on an emission source, so it's filtered by default to that particular emission source. If I set some filters here, like say I wanted this to just show me, just the prior fiscal year of records, and I apply that, those filters will apply to every emission source record list in the database. This functions exactly how a meter bill list does in utility management. If I go to a collection, which is the container of the emission source, I also have a record list. And this is actually new. We don't have this in utility management. You don't have record lists on buildings and organizations, but we thought for every level of the hierarchy, you should be able to see a filtered down view of the records that are applicable from that node in your hierarchy down. So that's what's going on here. If I go, we'll go to a records module in a little bit and talk about that, but I want to mention what a collection is. So a collection is kind of like a cost center in utility management. It's basically a folder. There's not a lot of details here. So if I go to collection details, I have a name and I have a code. But what's kind of cool is that I can change the icon for this to give it more meaning rather than it just being a static folder. In this case, it's a building, and I would say, oh, City Hall, that's a little bit different kind of building than like an office building, and I could get a different color. You can use colors within your hierarchy to have some kind of meaning to you. And then there's also a link here to a help page that tells you how to send a support ticket. And if there's an icon that you're like, I would really like to have this icon, we have a library that we use for these icons. You can send in a support ticket and say, hey, can we get this icon added in? And we might be able to get that in for you. And then you change, you can set what the parent collection is for this collection. You can also add some notes. We also include in CarbonHub, you'll see this throughout, these little help popovers, we call them help popover, just provides a little bit more instruction around what is this field for, to help you fill out the form whenever you're creating new collections. Collections are not like buildings. They don't have square floor area. They don't have locations. All of that information you would want to use utility management for that kind of information. Here, we're just looking for grouping things in folders in ways that you can categorize your emissions data. If I go back to an emission source, I didn't really talk through the properties of an emission source. Let's do that. I go here to emission source details. So you can see here, a lot of fields very similar to a meter, active, inactive. Why would I want an inactive emission source? If it's associated with a meter that's active, inactive, you may say, this is stuff that bills used to come in on and the records were generated on, but now it's inactive, which means I don't want new things coming in on it, but I want to have it there for historical reasons. That's the primary reason for having an inactive emission source. If you're like, I really don't need that data, then just delete it rather than making it inactive. It has a name and a code, a type. So a type is the same thing as a commodity. In utility management, we use the word type though, because in CarbonHub, you can track a whole bunch of stuff that's not just related to utilities and things like commuting and then purchase goods and stuff like that. So we felt type is a better terminology there, but we also reference this is the same thing as a commodity in utility management to help kind of make that connection. You can set the parent, you set a default scope category, a default factor. You can see again, the details of that factor from here. You can add notes. And emission sources can have locations. It's not required. That's different than a meter in utility management because meters need location or buildings need location in utility management for the weather data. We don't need that on the CarbonHub side, but for electricity, we do have a kind of a smart option to say, whenever I create an emission source that's electric, use my location to determine the factor to apply to it. So that's why location is provided here. So where I'm in right now, where I landed when I clicked the link from utility management is what we call the emission sources module in CarbonHub. And this is like the buildings and meters module in utility management or the accounts module in utility management. It's basically a hierarchy of your collections and emission sources. For each collection and emission source, you have an Insights Power View tab, which is just a collection of charts that we have hand curated to show, break down your data in different ways that you can look at it. These function just like Power Views and Energy Cap. You can expand it to see more details. You can copy the table data. You can see what filters have been applied. You can collapse it. For some widgets, there's an option to download the chart or export the data as CSV. And then you have your records tab, which we already went through. Two other items in this module that I think are really important to highlight is all collections and all emission sources. So these are just flat lists of all of your collections. And here you can filter things down. If you're looking for something in particular, you can see what the default factor is. You can do an edit here. So if you knew I need to make an edit to like 10 or so emission sources, this would be a really great place to go and filter it down. And then just kind of edit each one, open the dialog, save it, and come back and do the next one. From here, you can also download your emission sources to a spreadsheet, make changes there, and then import that spreadsheet. And of course, you can add emission sources from here as well. I do want to highlight one concept that we've added in CarbonHub is we put notes on a lot of things, and then we have a filter for notes contains in a lot of these different places, like different lists, which allows you to kind of tag or put specific text in your notes that give you another mechanism for categorization. So if I had a bunch of emission sources that were tagged with, I don't know, test for lack of a better term, I could search here for the hashtag test to filter that list down. So it would be a kind of a nice way to add more categorization than we have built into the system. Outside of the emission sources module, we have a couple other modules. First, we have dashboards and reports, and these are going to be very familiar to you because they are exactly the same modules that you have in utility management. In fact, because you're a customer that has utility management and CarbonHub, if you build a dashboard in utility management, that dashboard appears in CarbonHub, and vice versa. If you make edits or changes from one or the other places, you're touching the same dashboard, making the same changes. This gives you the ability to put charts with emissions data, cost, and use information all together in one view. Reports are the same way. The reports library is shared between both applications. Now, of course, some reports don't have GHG data, and that's why we have filters for greenhouse gas, so you can filter down to the reports that have it. And then any reports that you save will be available here or in utility management. And that's why we gave this section of the module bar a different background color to highlight these kind of elements are shared. They're common modules between those two applications. One more module that's specific to CarbonHub is the records module, and this would be akin to the bills module in utility management, where you have your list, your entire list of all your records, not filtered by anything. So that's what we call all records. And here we think of this as just like a scratch pad. You would come here to do some on-the-fly filtering if you're looking for something in particular. But then if you have a set of records, you're like, okay, I really want to save this filter set, this query, so I can come back to it later. Once you've set those filters, so for example, if I, let's just put a topmost collection filter in here for City Hall. Now I'm filtered down to City Hall. I can save this as a new list. Right, and it shows up here on the left side where it's under my list. We don't have sharing yet. That will be coming very soon. So you'll be able to share those filtered lists then with other employees or other colleagues within your organization. This works just like a bill list in the sense that you can add columns, reorder the columns, and you can apply kind of up to 3 levels of sorting onto the list itself. We have those same functions and features on bill lists and utility management. We don't have a ton of bulk actions right now from here, but you can do bulk delete from here. If you want to do more bulk editing, the best thing to do is to download this list to a spreadsheet, make your changes there, and then import them back in. And you can see that different from all collections, all emission sources, as I filtered this list down, this button changes to what the filter set is. So if I remove that filter, apply and close, you can see this change now. So if I'm downloading this, it's relative to the filters that have been applied to the list. Okay. A couple other things I want to highlight is you have settings in CarbonHub as well. System settings, users and roles, these are the same exact things that are in utility management. If you change the role on a user from CarbonHub, it will be the same change in utility management. So our roles are now more expansive. They include permissions from CarbonHub. So if I go to roles and permissions, for example, and open up full access, administrator full access, and scroll all the way down here to GHG emissions, these are a new set of permissions that we have added for CarbonHub related to creating and editing emission sources, collections, records, etc. So you can make roles that to say, I have some folks in my organization, I only want them in utility management. Maybe they only have view-only access in CarbonHub. You can make some of those custom roles. We added some of that already with some of the view-only roles. We added a lot of those view-only permissions in there. Some other shared settings between the two applications. Your data reporting settings. So again, energy use and floor area don't make a lot of sense in CarbonHub, but because these are applicable to both CarbonHub and utility management, you can set them from either place. The advanced setting for excluding months from charts does apply to CarbonHub. And then if you didn't see it in the release notes, in utility management, along with this release, we added the ability to create custom commodities and units. This is actually going to be really useful for CarbonHub folks who are going to start tracking a bunch of stuff with Scope 3 and wanting to create and do types and commodities to track all those in different units. So check out the release notes for utility management to learn how to create your own custom commodities and create your own custom units and manage those here. But again, if you create a type or commodity in CarbonHub, you're going to see that same commodity available in utility management and vice versa. And then lastly, so your target comparison settings are available here, the same settings that we've had in utility management. 2 elements that are specific to CarbonHub, your default categories and factors. This is where for each type, you say any emission source that's created on this using this type, assign this category as its default and this factor as its default. And then you also have custom factors, and you can also access the set of spreadsheets log from here as well. And again, this log is shared between both applications as well. The last thing I'll highlight in the UI is just search. This is the same, but we have added emission sources and collections to your search. So what's really nice about this is, and I'm going to demonstrate this here. So I'm in CarbonHub. I did a search. It's like, actually, I want to go to the meter. If I click on this, it's going to take me right into utility management for that thing I searched, which is a really nice way to jump around if you need to. So if I, again, search for City Hall and click on emission sources, that's going to take me back into CarbonHub. Probably the best way to know if I'm in CarbonHub or not is if you look at the sidebar. CarbonHub has this blue module bar with the icon, and CarbonHub, it's black. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because we kind of just went through a bunch of different concepts. And So next up, I'm going to start going through actually using the application, adding some records and stuff like that. So before we do that, I want to just check the Q&A. Is there anything out there that open questions to discuss?
There are two things, Dave. One was that some people were identifying that they are seeing a marketing message when they go to the CarbonHub tab instead of actually seeing a link. That is because we are still using my.energycap.com most likely to get into the application.
Yep.
You need to start using login.energycap.com if you want to talk about that real quick.
Yep. Yeah. So let me do that. So as part of the rollout of CarbonHub Utility Management, we are moving our existing utility management customers for your login to now be login.energycap.com, and that's what we call EnergyCap Home. And this is basically the place where your account is, and it's the place where for our customers who have access to multiple applications where you can log in and then go into one or the other. So you should have, or someone in your organization should have received instructions on how to set this all up. If you are still missing this, please reach out to your sales account manager or support to get your account linked up. But everybody should have been invited already. So we took the last users in all of the databases that had CarbonHub, active users that had logged in within the last year. You should have received an invitation email from EnergyCap saying like activate your account, or you've been invited to an organization. Once you click that link, it'll ask you to reset your password and all that. So once you have done all of that and you come back to log in later, you'll just use your credentials, log in. Now we're set up with SSO, so it's going to go out to Microsoft and say, yes, you are who you say you are, and then come back. If you don't have SSO, you'll see a password field and you put a password in. Then you get a box like this. And for most of you on the call who have only access to, you only have your single organization, right? You don't have multiple organizations within your access. You'll see a box like this, and you'll probably see two cards. And it'll be the name of your organization, one for CarbonHub, that's the blue here, and one for utility management. And from here, you can jump right into CarbonHub or utility management. If I go into utility management and I go to the buildings and meters module and CarbonHub, I see CarbonHub has moved. A good way to tell that you're in the right place is your URL is different now. It's not app.energycap.com. It's going to be something related to your organization, -UM or -CH, depending if you're in utility management or CarbonHub. And then it'll probably say .app, which is the environment, and then powered by energycap.com. So Jamie, we have had some folks contact support that run into similar issues, and it's usually related to IT blocking the new URL. So you may want to reach out to your IT folks to say, are we actively blocking this URL? And if you are, can we not block it? If you run into further issues, please reach out to our customer support team. They can help you with that.
Thanks, Mose.
Yep.
One other question, more a suggestion, is to add groups and benchmarks to CarbonHub. And I informed them that that is definitely on our roadmap, product roadmap right now. Do we have an estimated timeline for that? I
do not have an estimated timeline. Right now, we are planning out 2024 and thinking through all the things. And believe me, there is more things that we want to do with CarbonHub than we have time to do. So it's just a matter of figuring out what's the most urgent things and putting those first and then going forth. So I was going to save these comments for the end, but this is just the beginning. We have a lot that we want to add to this application over the coming months and years. So there's going to be a lot more, but this is a great start for your carbon footprint reduction journey. Okay. So the next kind of question, now that we know what things are and where things are, is how do I enter my data? Well, you have a few options, and lucky for you, if you're on this call, you are probably a utility management customer already. So it's really easy. Anything that you want to track emissions data on, make sure you link that meter up to an emission source, and we will calculate your emissions data based off of your bills, off your utility bills. That is the easy button, right? Your bills are coming in, whether you're using bill capture, it's coming in automatically into your system, and we are calculating the emissions data automatically for you. And then you get to focus on organizing your data in a way that makes sense, and doing analytics, and on that data, and not focusing on manual entry. Now, that's for utility emissions from utility bills, which is primarily scope 1 and 2. So if you're looking at scope 3, entering records in CarbonHub, you can do that manually. And we've done a lot of work to make that a very easy and simple and intuitive process. And I'm going to walk through an example of that. And then we have the option to import in spreadsheets in bulk. And this is another area where we want to do a lot more with having a kind of a bill capture like service for CarbonHub to bring in, fine financial data automatically, and you can calculate emissions off of that, or having connections with smart analytics. So if you have smart meters, capturing that data and creating emissions data off that as well. So there's a lot more to come into this space, but we've already given you quite a bit that you can use right out of the gate. So let's look at some examples. I'm in utility management now, and I'm going to go back to my favorite electric meter, City Hall ELE 01. And if we look, whoops, I was looking at the emission source. There we go. If we look at the bills, I have some bills up here to the end of 2022, and we can see that this meter is linked to an emission source in CarbonHub. So I'm going to go ahead and just enter a new bill on this meter. And we're going to make this for 31 days. And this is an $8,000 bill and 80,000 kilowatt hours. And I'm going to save that bill real quick. So there's my new bill, January 2023, $8,000, 80,000 kilowatt hours. If I jump to CarbonHub and go to my records tab, there's my new record, 80,000 kilowatt hours. We also, you can have the cost here. So I'll show you that real quick. So we do include a field for cost if there is cost. So there's the cost. If I open that record, we can see there's the quantity, 80,000 kilowatt hours, 8,000, and we use the RFC greenhouse gas factor to calculate the emissions based off of the energy consumption. And I could jump to the bill if I wanted to. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is, well, where is that factor set? Two places. On the individual record, you can change the factor. But then on the emission source itself, you can set the factor here. So when the bill is entered on the meter and the bill comes through, we say, okay, what's the factor on that emission source, linked emission source, and that's what we use to calculate those records. So as your bills are coming into the system, we are calculating emissions records automatically, which is really nice. Okay, and then what I want to do now is talk about, we're gonna talk about manual entry a little bit later. I want to focus on, okay, so I have my electric and my natural gas utility bills already set up previously, and that's all calculating emissions data. That's great. But what about if there's something new that I have utility bills on in energy in utility management, how do I start tracking that? So let's go back to utility management, and let's look at this trash meter that I have here. So trash, believe it or not, there's emissions that you can calculate from that. And there are factors that tell you per ton of trash that has been transported and processed, what's the emission, what's the carbon footprint of that activity. But you can see this meter has not been linked to an emission source. So how do I start calculating those records? Well, the best way is you could go and link to a CarbonHub emission source. Now you would have to create the emission source on the other side and then select from the list. That gets kind of tedious if you have a lot of meters that you want to link up. So we added a new setup sheet or spreadsheet for link meters to emission sources. So I'm going to download this sheet. And what I'm going to do is I know I want to just get all of my trash or refuse, in this case, refuse meters that are under city buildings. So once I download this sheet, I'll zoom in here for you. So you can see, oh, that's too much. I have 7 meters here, or 8 meters. We give you the kind of read-only information about those meters. And then what you can do on the right here is link it to an emission source that exists already, or in this scenario, this is a great way to do this. Say, create a new emission source for me. And I want to use, in this case, I want to use scope 3, waste generated in operations. And this is going to be the US region. And we provide these fields because we have thousands of factors in our database now. So to go through a list looking for that exact factor is going to be really difficult. So we've added these fields as a way to filter down. So you can filter by region, you can filter by category. So in this case, I'm looking for waste management and remediation services. These categories are NAICS, North American Industry Classification System categories, which is what EPA uses to categorize some of their GHG factors. And now that I have done that, I have a fairly decent list to pick from. And in this case, I don't know what my specific thing is that I'm landfilling, but we have a couple mixed ones here. So we have mixed, MSW stands for municipal solid waste landfill. And that's what I'm going to pick. And now once I have set that up, this is the beauty of using spreadsheets. Once I've done that for one, I can copy and paste. For the other ones, I'll save that. And I'll come back to the application and load this in. And it's been successful. Notice how I got a link up here all of a sudden. So this is now linked to CarbonHub. So let's go over to CarbonHub. And there's my emissions already. And I have five records already that calculate from bills. So it's that simple to say I have bills for commodities, and I'd really like to start tracking emissions on that. So link it up, create an emission source for me. Now, the note is that when we create them automatically, we don't want to make assumptions where you want to put those. So we put them in what we call the no parent node. And if you come, you'll see there's a little tag here that says you have 8 with no parent. So if I click this link, it filters it down to no parent, and then I can go through and move these one by one to their parent location, or I can download this filtered set to a spreadsheet and do a bulk edit there and re-import. But that's a quick way to get emissions data out of meters that you have linked before. Yep, just reiterating what we've done before. So let me pause for a moment and say, there are some limitations around when you have meters and emission sources that are linked. And I want to talk about that a little bit. When you have a meter that is linked to an emission source, emission records are automatically calculated from the meter bills. We've seen that. The generated emission records are locked down, except for scope category, GHG factor, and notes. We've seen that. The commodity is kept in sync between the meter and the emission source. So what that means is if I come to this new emission source that I just created, and I go to edit it, and if I change this from refuse to recycle, we say, nope, the origin of all this data is from utility management. You have bills that are used to calculate emissions records. Commodity has a lot more significance with how bills are entered in utility management. So if you want to change the commodity, you need to go to utility management and do it there. Commodity really doesn't have an impact in CarbonHub. We used to we used to have relationships between factors and commodities. We broke that relationship because we found that that was inflexible and actually very brittle. So type is really just a way to categorize and group your emission sources. So if I go over here and edit this meter and changed it to recycle and saved, and then went back to CarbonHub, you'll see it's been updated to recycle. So that's one limitation of having meters and emission sources linked. When you unlink a meter from an emission source, we delete any records that were generated from those bills, and you cannot delete a meter that is linked to an emission source. So the next question that I want to talk about is, how do I enter scope 3 emissions? So we talked about entering or getting emissions calculated from your utility bills, adding scope 3 that could be calculated from utility bills, but what about scope 3 emissions that doesn't come from utility bills? For example, maybe employee commuting, for example. So let's go over to CarbonHub and look at an example there, because this is where CarbonHub really starts to shine as far as the flexibility that we have. And I'm going to go to my city of Happy Valley, and we have this non-utilities node, and we already have an employee commuting node. And we have bus, employee vehicles, light rail, and subway. And I was supposed to delete this before this demo so we could show it. So I'm going to delete it and we'll recreate it. But hey, this is how you delete emission sources in CarbonHub. Look at that. So let's go back to City Happy Valley and our employee commuting collection. And I'm going to create a new emission source for subway. So I have bus already, I have employee vehicles, I have light rail, which is like tracking folks that are commuting in from suburbs to city center. But depending on where your organization is, you may actually have some folks that live in the city center and are using subway to commute in. And maybe there's one for telecommuting that you could add here. And that's the great thing about the commodities and units we added, is you could add anything you want to track, as long as you can come up with a commodity name for it and a unit as a way to track it. So this is going to be subway. And we'll just say it's a mass transit type. And notice that as soon as I picked mass transit, it already filled out scope category and GHG factor. And that's because we have those default settings based on types to say, whenever I create an emission source, use this scope category and factor, but it's just a default. You can override it. In this case, it makes sense that commuter rail is not what I want to do. So when I open up what we call a factor searcher, a drop down where you look for your factors, you can see, oh man, there's a whole bunch in here. So I don't even know where to search. So we have this new option called Help Me Choose. And you can either start typing to look for keywords, or you can do the same thing that we did in the spreadsheet where I said, well, this is going to be United States. And I'm looking for transportation. And some of this is in miles and some of it's in dollars. So really, I just want length or distance. And okay, there we go. We've got commuter rail, intercity rail, light duty truck. There we go. Transit rail, subway, and tram. And if I select that, we can see the description for that. Not there, that's for the control, but I can open the factor details so I can see a little bit more information about this factor to make sure, yep, this is the one I want. And I'm going to save that. So now I have a new emission source, and as you start using CarbonHub and creating new things, you'll see that every step along the way, we're trying to provide you with guidance to say, what's the next step you need to take? So you've just created a new emission source, but you don't have any records. So the next step is, let's create a record. And here you can see, as soon as I create that record, we're auto-populating the emission source. You put in your start and end date. So let's say for my organization, we track this quarterly. We send out a survey to our employees and gather this information to say, like, how many days are you commuting into the office and what mechanism of transportation are you using? So we'll say this is for the first quarter of 2023. And then I have 3 options for how to enter a record. It can be based off of use, which is calculations from something that was consumed or some activity that occurred. So kilowatt hours consumed, tons of waste that were transported, miles ridden on a subway train. I also have cost, which is a great way to begin your scope 3 reporting, which allows you to say, well, I don't know how much we use, but I know how much we spent on this activity. So you can calculate your emissions based off of those spend factors, spend-based factors. Or you can say it's direct or offset, and you can say, whether it's just you're putting in the emissions directly or you have an offset that you want to record, to say, I already know the number, it was given to me by somebody else, so I just need a way to record it in. This may be if you have an external supplier or downstream supplier who is calculating emissions and then sending you information. This would be how you would enter that in. But I'm going to go back to use, because in this case I'm doing mileage. And let's pretend that this is an international organization, so they have companies all over the world, and some of the data they got in was in kilometers instead of miles. Well, this is another improvement we made with CarbonHub is before you would have to put that information in with the exact unit that the factor was associated with, which meant you would have to do some math and calculation outside. But now, as long as we have a unit in that category, we can do the calculations for you. So if you have the data in kilometers, we can convert it to miles because that's what the factor is. This also exposes, if you have something that we don't have in the system, you can create your own custom units now. So you can have that custom unit, assign it to the right category, and provide the conversion factor. So in this case, we'll say it was 1,000 kilometers. There's no cost associated with that. I could add notes. I could add attachments. So if I had an Excel file or results from a survey that I wanted to attach to this as kind of an audit trail of where this information came from, and then I can save it. And once I save it, the emissions are calculated. If I go to the records, there the record is. And I can open this record. I can see the emissions that was calculated from it. If I click on this factor, I see the numbers that were used based on the start and end date. And I can edit this. Now, this isn't generated from a bill, so I can change everything about this record. All right, let's go back to PowerPoint here. So I just want to kind of repeat this. The emission source, the scope category, and GHG factor are inherited from your default settings based on type when you create that new emission source. When you create a record on that emission source, we inherit the scope category and factor from that emission source. But again, you can change it on the record if need be. You can search for factors by region, unit category, and factor category. You can calculate those emissions by cost or use, or you can enter emissions and offsets directly, and you can add notes and attachments. One of the other things I want to highlight is, okay, I just created an emissions record on an emissions source that's not linked to a meter. So what does that mean in utility management? Well, in utility management, we know you have your emissions data there, and I have had it And one of the value of having it there is that you can see how your buildings, what your GHG intensity is, emissions per floor area for all your buildings, and benchmark your buildings and see which ones are performing well or not, which is great because all of that emissions data is usually calculated from utility bills that are on those meters that are associated with those buildings. But we have found that trying to do all of your GHG reporting and utility management was restrictive. And that's why we created CarbonHub as a standalone thing. So we didn't want to take away your emissions data from utility management because we understand the value of being able to break it down by your buildings and floor area. So any emissions data that is associated with an emission source linked to a meter will show up in utility management. So it'll show up on your maps, it'll show up in your power views as you navigate that tree. But if you're on a building organization, we put a banner at the top that says, this may not be all of your emissions data. And if you want to see all of it, you need to go to CarbonHub. And that's because of things that an example of what we just did, where in CarbonHub, you're not only tracking your emissions data from your utilities associated with your buildings, but you're doing it for other activities like employee commuting that don't make sense over in utility management. So depending on how you structure your hierarchy in CarbonHub and whether you're linking it up to meters or not, some of that emissions data will probably be in different nodes of your hierarchy in CarbonHub and not in utility management. So when you're on City of Happy Valley, we don't want you to think in utility management, oh, this is all of the emissions for City of Happy Valley. It's like, no, that's all your emissions associated with your utility bills. If you have other things like employee commuting also that you would associate with City of Happy Valley, that's in a different place. And you want to go to CarbonHub to look at that. I'm going to pause to do some Q&A. I don't see any open right now.
There was one question there, Dave, about CarbonHub data not aligning with utility management, that is specifically with scope categories. So scope categories can be out of sync. Once the record is generated, you still have the ability to edit the scope category in CarbonHub for a linked meter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where they can go out of sync. The emission, the GHG setting in utility management is what's driven by the default. But once the record is created and somebody changed it, it can potentially go out of sync. Is there anything else you want to clarify on that?
I would say there is no setting in utility management anymore. All the settings are in CarbonHub. So you change the setting on that emission source or on the records. Now, unlike utility management before we launched CarbonHub this past week, if you changed a factor, we would recalculate all your emissions. Well, now your factor on your emission source is just a default. So we're not going to recalculate it because you may be switching from a spend-based method to a use-based method, and that's why you're changing your factor. You don't want to recalculate your historical records. So if you need to make a change and recalculate some records, you go to the individual record and change it there, or you can download them in a spreadsheet if you need to update them in bulk.
Sounds good.
Okay. I believe so, Daniela. Recording will be available.
Correct.
So we had two other scenarios that we were going to walk through that we don't have time today to talk through. And I'm sure Lalit, we're going to have, so let me skip ahead real quick. We're going to have monthly deep dive CarbonHub training webinars that are going to be available for our CarbonHub customers. And this will be a great time to come in and ask questions. And the focus of those will be not necessarily getting started, but like, I have solar. How do I configure that in CarbonHub? Or how do I represent my PPAs? How do I create custom factors? Those will be the topics that we would focus on in those. And we're going to be launching a series for that. And so we don't have the specific details here to share with you today, but we will be sending those out, and we'll probably put notifications in the application. By the way, a little plug, so you may not know, because we know that some people don't. Years ago, we added notifications to utility management, and we send updates. So if there's an update to the app, or there's a training opportunity or something like that, we publish those as notifications in the application. You can adjust your settings to say what you want to do for each type. You can get them in the application, or you can get them emailed to you. Our customer service messages are things where we would send, webinar coming up, or there's going to be an outage, updates and new features. Whenever we have an update to the application, we put those there. If we have something that we want to put out to say, hey, this is an article we wrote up to help you use CarbonHub, we would put those in the help articles, tips, and suggestions. So I highly recommend subscribing to those notifications, or at least turning them on in the app and checking them periodically, so you don't miss opportunities like that for training and miss the new features that we're putting out there. Some other resources for help. We have a section in our help center dedicated entirely to CarbonHub that we launched along with CarbonHub. So that's available at helpcenter.energygap.com/ch. If you go to helpcenter.energygap.com, it's a new page. You can click on the CarbonHub and go there. Also, another place you may want to check out is Eco Champions. This is our community where you can share ideas and ask questions amongst other folks who use utility management and CarbonHub. We also have a channel there to vote on new features that we're thinking about adding. And then lastly, we have 2 Catalyst user conferences coming up in 2024. We have an international one in London in February, and then we have another one in the US in Denver in May. I believe that we are out of time. I'll stick on the line if there's any more questions, but Daniela, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. I don't have anything else for you guys. So if anyone has questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. We'll, like Dave said, we'll stick around for a few minutes, but other than that, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will send this out either this afternoon or tomorrow. So be on the lookout. It'll be in your email, and it will be shareable with your team. So you can forward either the link or the email, and everyone will have access to it. So thank you guys all for being here. All right, and people are slowly dropping off, so we can go ahead and shut things down. Oh, I think we did get a question. I don't know if you see it. Can we add new buildings in CarbonHub or facilities in CarbonHub? Oh, Dave, you're muted.
Buildings are not really a thing in CarbonHub. We would consider those to be collections in CarbonHub. So you can create collections to categorize your emission sources. There's no floor area associated with that. So if you care about floor area, you want to have the building in utility management with a meter and link it up to your emission source.
I will also say, I know Dave kind of mentioned this in his slide, but if you guys have any other questions, you can always post them in Eco Champions. We've got conversations going on in there, and we can always help there. And obviously the service team is always available for you guys. So anyways, we'll let everybody go. I hope you guys all have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.